Hello, welcome to another video from the conscientious biologist, Ben Gallagher. This video is the first in a series of 2 on the respiratory system. This is a system overview and focuses on the gas exchange that goes on in the alveoli. Now, because of that, I'd strongly recommend that you've watched the Transport Through Membranes 1 video, which is on diffusion and active transport. It's only diffusion that you'll need for this topic, but it's really useful to go back and review that one if you haven't watched it already. This is suitable for GCSE level. And as always, if you enjoy this style of learning, if you enjoy these videos, please do go to my channel and subscribe. Thanks. So let's start with the simple question of what does the respiratory system do? And it's just gas exchange, and that's a key term, gas exchange. And the gases that are being exchanged are oxygen, so the respiratory system has to put oxygen into the blood, and exchange it for carbon dioxide. So the carbon dioxide needs to be taken out of the blood, shifted out of the body back into the atmosphere. So you've got this loop of oxygen and carbon dioxide being exchanged for one another. But that throws up a really important question of why does the body need oxygen? Why do we need to bring the oxygen in? And as a secondary question, where does the carbon dioxide come from? Why have we got carbon dioxide in our blood that we need to remove and send back out into the atmosphere? And the answer to this you should know from previous studies lower down the school. It's respiration. So respiration is a reaction that happens in cells to get energy from glucose. If you think back to photosynthesis, photosynthesis is a reaction that happens in plants to grab energy from the sunlight and lock it up in a molecule of glucose. Respiration is just about breaking that glucose down to get the energy back out. And the best way to do that is to react the glucose with oxygen, because that's going to provide the energy, and that energy powers everything that the cells need to do. So we know there's glucose made by photosynthesis that animals will have eaten the glucose. Glucose contains the energy, so we know we've got that arrow, the energy's got to come out. And the best way to do that is to react the glucose with oxygen. So that's why we need oxygen going in, because every single cell in our body needs to react the glucose with the oxygen, because that's what's going to give the energy out. But as waste products of that, you get carbon dioxide and water. So every single cell doing aerobic respiration needs the oxygen to break down the glucose, but is also producing carbon dioxide. That carbon dioxide is going to go into your blood, so it needs to go back to your lungs to be got rid of. So, one key thing, just above my head here, you'll notice I've just put brackets around the energy. That's because everything is either made up of matter or energy. They're 2 very different things, and all of the chemical atoms and molecules in that equation are matter. Energy is a different thing. So we'll just put it in brackets to show that. Now, a term I used a second ago, this is aerobic respiration because it requires oxygen from the air. So please know that key term, aerobic respiration. So what this video really needs to focus on is how is the respiratory system adapted to maximize gas exchange to provide for that respiration. So let's take a look then at the respiratory system as a whole. So when we're talking about your respiratory system, we're basically talking about your lungs, and your lungs are up here in your chest. You've got one on either side. If you look at the picture that I've put up on there, over on the far side, you can see a lung that's totally covered. That's as the lung should look inside your body. The one slightly nearest to us is kind of opened up so you can see more of the internal structures. Now you're going to need to know all of the names of those separate parts on there. So we're going to start building this up and adding different things to this. So first off, let's talk about the air coming in and the air going out of your respiratory system. So the air going in, so all of this air around us, is mostly nitrogen. Lots of people go, oh, we breathe in oxygen. Well, the oxygen in the air that we breathe in only accounts for about 20% of the air. 80% is nitrogen, and that's because nitrogen is an incredibly stable molecule. It's 2 nitrogen atoms, and they're held together by a triple covalent bond. So that's 3 very strong bonds holding those 2 nitrogen atoms together. That means it's really, really difficult to get rid of it in the atmosphere. So it's been there for millions of years, and it will continue to be there for millions of years. But it's that 20% oxygen that's really, really important that we need to focus on. So when you breathe in, you're taking in some oxygen. 20% of the air is oxygen. What your lungs do is pull some of that oxygen out of the air to put it into your blood, so that when you breathe out, you're still breathing out that 80% nitrogen. That goes in, goes out, doesn't really do anything because it's so stable. But in what you breathe out, there's now about 16% oxygen. and 4% carbon dioxide. So you've switched 4% of the oxygen went into your body and to give out carbon dioxide to now add up to 40% of what's in the air. So you've exchanged that 4% for 4%, okay? Now that means it's not an amazing system. Your lungs aren't highly efficient, but they're more than efficient enough. You can breathe enough, you can get plenty of oxygen in. And in terms of evolution, evolution drives adaptations that are good enough, that are better than we had previously. And your lungs are good enough to provide all the oxygen you need to get enough energy so that you can survive, which is all evolution cares about. So that's the air going in and out. You need to know those percentages. Let's start labeling some of this up now. Quite obviously, that one over there is the lung. There's 2 lungs, so I've just labeled that one there. But let's look at some of the other structures. That tube coming down, this is the tube when you breathe in. So you breathe in through your nose and your mouth, and they join together just kind of back behind your soft palate. They join together and go down this main tube that you may have heard referred to as your windpipe, but the correct name for that, as I put up there, is the trachea. Okay. Now you'll notice on the trachea as well, you can see there's lines across it in the diagram. Those lines are representing bands of cartilage that go around the tube of the trachea. Now cartilage is the same material that makes up your ears and your nose. So it's a bit squashy, but it's basically relatively solid. Now those rings of cartilage help your trachea to stay open so it doesn't collapse and you don't suffocate. You can feel those rings of cartilage. If you run your finger very gently up your trachea there, you can feel the kind of bumps. Those are the rings of cartilage. So air's going to go in through your trachea. Your trachea is then going to branch into 2. Those are the bronchi. The bronchi go to each lung. So it's 2 bronchi because you've got 2 lungs. The bronchi will then branch out into loads and loads of bronchioles. And the bronchioles just branch and branch and branch and get smaller and smaller. If you imagine a tree going up, you've got a big thick trunk, branches into smaller branches, each branch into smaller ones again, and smaller and smaller. So if you look at the structure inside a lung, it does look like a tree where it's branching, getting smaller and smaller. But all of those branches that come off the original bronchi are bronchioles. Now, at the end of every bronchiole, you've got a little cluster of tiny little bags. Those are the alveoli. We're going to be looking at those in much more detail in the next slide. But it's those little bags that are the site of gas exchange. So those are the really, really important bits. That's where the diffusion takes place. If we add a few bits to our diagram now, you can see I've just added a sort of curve at the bottom of the diagram there. That's your diaphragm, and that's a sheet of muscle that goes right the way across your middle. It kind of totally cuts you in half internally. If I just put up there a couple of other key words, when I say it separates you internally and cuts you in half, it separates your chest section, which is your thorax, from your lower torso, which is your abdomen. And pretty much all animals are made up of a thorax, a chest section, an abdomen, a head, and limbs. That's your arms and legs. So you've got thorax, abdomen, head, and limbs. Pretty much every creature you can think of will have those same parts. But your diaphragm totally separates you inside. It's like the floor in your house. That's the floor of the upstairs, the ceiling of the downstairs. It's one floor, but it makes it 2 totally different layers inside your body, your 2 totally different chambers. And that's separated by this diaphragm. The diaphragm is one of the key things that controls breathing. We'll get to that later in this lesson. If I just fade those names out though, and let's add another thing here. Those little blue ovals I've drawn on, those are representing the ribs, but in kind of cross section. Imagine if I've cut down through your body, so you're just looking at the ribs. Those would, of course, come right the way round to the front, and the ribs serve as kind of a protective cage around your lungs, but also around your heart, because don't forget that's in the middle there behind your sternum, okay, nicely protected. In between your ribs, you've got muscles. Those are the intercostal muscles. Those are really, really important as well for when you need to breathe, for the mechanism of breathing. So we'll look at those again a little bit later as well. Let's jump onto the alveoli now. Excuse me. Now the alveoli are the tiny air sacs at the end of the bronchioles that we said a moment ago are the site of gas exchange. If I pull up a very basic drawing I've done of alveoli there, what I need you to imagine is that tube that you've got coming in from the corner of the slide. That's the end of a very small bronchiole that's branched and branched and branched, and it's got to this point. But even then, you'll see that that bronchiole then branches out again, and at the end of each one of those branches, you've got one of these balls. Now, those little spheres, those are the alveoli, and those are like tiny, tiny microscopic balloons that can just very slightly inflate and deflate. And it's air going into those that can pass its oxygen into the blood. So if we summarize that quickly, if you look up, there's a arrow coming in showing air coming in, the gas exchange happening in the alveoli, and then the air containing the carbon dioxide going back out. So that diagram above my head is a really nice, very, very simplistic way to try and think about what's going on in the alveoli. That's probably what I'd give to maybe a year 7 or 8 class. We need to look at it in much, much more detail. So if I expand the diagram now, and we look at one alveoli, okay, so what I put over there, that's representing one of those spheres from that diagram. Now, the first thing I want you to notice is the walls of this alveoli. Look very carefully at what I've done. You've got kind of the two lines. It looks like I've double layered it. But actually look closely and you'll see that I've separated that out into lots and lots of different cells. The little black blobs that I've drawn in there, I've put there to try and represent the nuclei in each one of those cells. So have a look at it and please realise that the alveoli, the walls of the alveoli are 1 cell thick. That means it's a very, very short distance that the oxygen has to move out into the blood and the carbon dioxide back in the other direction. So just appreciate that first. Secondly then, let's link this up to the diagram that you've got up above my head. Let's put that blue arrow coming in, same as the blue arrow on the one above my head. That's the air coming in. Now remember we said that air is roughly 20% oxygen with virtually no carbon dioxide. We're not going to worry about the 80% nitrogen because that just comes in, goes out, doesn't play any role in this. So we've got the air coming in. So we've got oxygen inside the alveoli now. Now that oxygen's got to go into the blood. So you've got to have blood very close to the alveoli. So what I've just added on there in red, that's a capillary. Now capillaries are the tiniest blood vessels. And again, if you look at it, you can see it's 1 cell thick. So the oxygen only needs to move through the 1 cell thick wall of the alveoli, through the 1 cell thick wall of the capillary, and it's in the bloodstream. So let's just label that as a capillary. Now, of course, in the capillaries, you've got red blood cells, which I've put on there now. Now, note how small the capillary in the alveoli must be. The red blood cells have to travel through in single file. That's how small they are. So if you link this up to what you've covered before, hopefully you've watched the video on surface area to volume ratios. By both of these structures, the alveoli and the capillaries, both being so small, they have a very small volume, but a very large surface area, which is perfect for exchange. And remember, this is the site of exchange. If you're not sure what I'm talking about, please go back and watch the video on surface area to volume ratio. It's in the transport through membranes playlist if you're struggling to find it. So let's look at where that oxygen has to move. So if I put some arrows on here, sorry, that labels the red blood cells, but if I put arrows on there, those arrows are representing diffusion, the movement from the high concentration of oxygen in the alveoli to the low concentration of oxygen in the blood, because it's only going to be deoxygenated blood that's coming to the lungs. So we know it's got a low concentration already. But look at where I've put those arrows going to. Every one of those arrows is going directly into a red blood cell, because that's where the oxygen needs to be. It needs to attach to hemoglobin molecules, which are proteins. Remember, proteins do everything. They're so important in biology. So the red blood cells are full of hemoglobin protein. The oxygen needs to diffuse from the alveoli into the red blood cell and attach to a hemoglobin molecule. Now, when hemoglobin has oxygen attached to it, it's called oxyhemoglobin, which I've written over the side there. So just very quickly, as a little check for yourself, pause the video for a second and count how many membranes one oxygen molecule has to go through before it can attach to hemoglobin. Just pause for a second and have a count. Now, I'm going to hope you did that, because I'll give you the answer now. From inside the alveoli, it has to diffuse through the first membrane into the cell of the wall of the alveoli. Then it needs to diffuse out of that cell, so go through a second membrane. Then it needs to diffuse into the cell that builds the capillary wall. Then it needs to diffuse out of that cell to get into the capillary itself. So that's a fourth membrane. Then it needs to diffuse through the membrane of the red blood cell to get into the red blood cell. So that's 5. So it's 5 membranes that the oxygen needs to diffuse through before it gets to hemoglobin. But hopefully you can see that's the absolute minimum possible number that can be achieved. And that's only achievable because you've got a 1 cell thick wall of the alveoli and a 1 cell thick wall of the capillary. So we've got oxygen going into the red blood cells now, creating oxyhemoglobin. Let's talk about the carbon dioxide now. So that carbon dioxide is carried in the blood in the plasma, which I've just linked on there. The plasma is the liquid part of the blood that everything else floats around in. Really important that you know that. Carbon dioxide travels in the plasma. Because if you get a diagram like this in the exam, which is quite common, and they'll ask you to put arrows, you must have your arrows going to the right places. So oxygen going from the alveoli into the red blood cell, carbon dioxide coming out of the plasma. So your arrows should look like that. From the plasma, not the red blood cells, going back into the alveoli. Now that carbon dioxide is then going to leave. You're going to push that out when you breathe out. And that air going out, as we've already mentioned, is 16% oxygen, and it's carrying that 4% carbon dioxide. But of course, that means most of the oxygen is breathed straight back out. So I'm going to add one more arrow there to show that a lot of that oxygen that came in actually just goes back with the carbon dioxide and is passed straight out. Now, it's probably a good idea to take a screenshot now before I add something to mess this diagram up a bit. So take a quick screenshot there for your notes. Okay, hopefully you've done that, because of course this would be a very inefficient system if that was it, if that whole diagram represented everything, because most of the surface of the alveoli there isn't in contact with the capillary. So I need you to appreciate that there are capillaries totally covering each and every alveoli. So the blood supply to each alveoli is amazing, meaning every bit of surface, or as much surface as possible of the alveoli, is directly in contact with the blood supply. Okay, and that's it for this lesson. So we've looked at the whole overview of how the system is put together, what all the different parts are. And then we've looked at the alveoli and how the whole system is set up to get the oxygen to those alveoli to maximize the diffusion and the reabsorption of the carbon dioxide. So make sure you've really understood this, and then go straight on to respiratory system 2, which is on ventilation. Ventilation is the mechanism of breathing. It's really important topic, and I split that into a separate video for you. Please do go straight to that one. As always, if you like this, please do subscribe. There should be a link coming up on this page now, and there's also a link to that next video. Thank you.